Okay, I think we have everyone and it's officially time. As I know, these sessions go by very quickly. So thank you all for joining. I'll introduce the panel shortly. I'm just going to do a little bit of an intro to those of you who don't know me and don't know Oliver Wyman, which is the consulting firm that I work for. So Oliver Wyman is a global management consulting firm, but we've got a rapidly growing team based in Newcastle. So we have offices all over the world. We're regionally organised, so our Newcastle team sits within our kind of European practice. And within Newcastle, our team is data and analytics specialists. So everybody in the Newcastle team works with clients on data strategy and data analytics projects. My background is I started my career at Oliver Wyman as a strategy consultant. In those days, there weren't data analytics specialists at Oliver Wyman, or more broadly, there were fewer, I think, in the world. It was the days when writing SQL queries was considered pretty cutting edge, which is what I spent a lot of my early career doing. And then I went to into industry for a couple of product owner roles, which were very analytics focused. The first one at a travel startup that was acquired by Booking.com, and then I went to work at Sage when I moved to the Northeast. And then I rejoined Oliver Wyman 3 years ago to help build out this team that's based in Newcastle. We've now got around 40 people based in Newcastle, and my client-facing work is to drive commercial impact via digital partnerships, always with that data component. So I typically work for private sector organisations who are looking to drive commercial value from their data in some shape or form. So data strategy is often the topic that I'm working on. I think kind of maybe it's helpful just to describe how we think about that horizontal aspect versus vertical industry specialization. So I think a lot of consulting firms kind of maybe the last 15 years were very industry focused, and because there was this kind of concept that was probably correct, which is to really be able to add value to a client, you need to really understand their industry. So strategy was a lot about, I deeply know kind of banking regulation, so I can consult to financial services clients to help them navigate their strategy. I think that still holds true, but obviously what we see is this need for horizontal capabilities and horizontal skill sets, and actually that it's that cross-fertilization of ideas across industries, which is actually really valuable for clients. So our Newcastle Oliver Wyman team sits in this digital horizontal practice, and we execute data analytics projects across these different industries. So I think sort of on that theme, our panel today that I'd like to introduce you to is really a cross-industry panel. Everybody has got a kind of strong data and information focus, and I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion that cuts across, the specific focus areas of the different organisations. So Cate Ward joins us from Cate started her career at Microsoft, quickly moving into a BI specialist role, supporting clients with developing their BI capabilities and tooling. And then she moved to be a data architect at Avis Budget Group, a car rental company, and before then joining Sage as a VP of Architecture and VP of Data and Analytics. So welcome, Cate.
Hi.
Graeme joins us from Connect Health, where he's the CIO. Graeme started his career as a software developer, working for a number of companies, moving through leadership positions, and then taking an IT portfolio manager role at British Airways. Graeme then also worked at Sage. So I promise the whole panel didn't always work at Sage, but there are three of us on the call who have. And Graeme was director of product engineering, focused on payroll at Sage, before then joining Connect Health as the CIO. Alex joins us as a senior data scientist from DWP Digital. So Alex started her career as a statistician, working on fraud and error analysis, and has then moved to work in different parts of DWP, and now works as a senior data scientist within the health and disability team. And last but not least, Cate joins us as the head of information statistics at Northumbria NHS Trust. Cate has worked in the NHS throughout her career, starting her career in the Regional Health Authority and then moving to Northumbria and helping to build out what is now quite a large team of data analysts as a head of information and statistics. So welcome to all of you. one final kind of slide for me before I stop sharing the screen is just a framework really that we use to think about the different aspects of data strategy. And the reason I'm sharing this is because data strategy is a very broad topic. And I think sometimes what I find in early conversations with people is that they're coming at it from a very specific angle, but they haven't necessarily kind of considered all of the different components that would typically make up a comprehensive data strategy. So we think about kind of at the top this business purpose or organizational purpose, which is really around, what are we trying to achieve as an organization with our data? So there's been this massive growth in the availability of data with digital systems and all of the trends that we see across digital landscape. But the question is always, what are the key areas where we're really trying to drive organizational value with that data? Once you understand that question, then there are these 4 kind of enabling areas. So there's data itself, which would cover things like what data am I collecting, what's the quality like, what are my policies around governance, all of those kind of foundations. Technology would cover the actual technologies and systems you're using to manage data and to manage models. People and organization is all around, what's your leadership structure, how are you working with the business, and also what's the mix of skills and specializations that you need to support what you're trying to achieve. And then finally analytics, which is more around what you're actually doing with that data. So that can be what kind of analytics and modeling are you doing, how are you productionizing those models, how are you enabling the business to do that self-service, and also how are you, which is getting more and more important, how are you sort of monitoring that models, which become really important parts of your ongoing business, are well maintained and kind of the assumptions that are within those. And then finally at the bottom, this kind of point, which is if you're setting data strategy or trying to execute against it, how do you actually orchestrate that? It touches almost every part of the business. So in a way, it can be a real challenge if you're leading in this space to make sure that you're striking that balance between foundational work and more delivering the value the business is looking for, and obviously managing different stakeholder needs throughout. So before we kind of open up to the panel, I'd like to poll the audience if possible. I think we've got a poll waiting in the wings, which is, and the first poll is just to ask you what size your business is. Can someone who's monitoring the room kick off that poll? Oh no, you haven't got it. Okay, it's fine. The first one being, okay, which of those areas we just talked through would you find as the organisation to be the biggest challenge? I think this will really help us as a panel to kind of tailor our focus for the conversation and what the audience is kind of most interested in. So if you go into the poll tab, you can see kind of those different areas. Which of these do you think is the biggest challenge at your organisation? Okay, so that's pretty interesting. So basically, the most popular 2, I'm not actually too surprised, is the business purpose value question. So what am I actually trying to achieve with my data? How do I most value? And then people and organisation, and how do I have the right skills to kind of execute against that? Interesting, nobody has said technology. Very interesting. Okay, helpful. So I guess to kick us off, Cate, would you be able to share a little bit about Sage and kind of how you're thinking about data strategy and which of these kind of areas you're covering or most focused on, and how you've been through the process of really setting that strategy and starting to execute against it?
Yeah, sure. So I took over sort of data team within the IT function about 3 years ago. And before that, I'd been doing architecture and looking after the enterprise architecture function. And it became very apparent in that role that there wasn't an awful lot of focus on data as a business. There were certainly pockets across functions and regions of good data people and good intent. But at the very base of it, the business was struggling to get access to data as a good starting point to understand the value of data and to drive any meaningful insights from it. So at that point, I said to the CIO, my boss, that we need to focus on data, and hence the data team was born. And our strategy from the start has been pretty much a technical one, or at least from an IT perspective, of let's get the foundations in place. Let's democratize data so that our business users can all get access to the data that they need to do what they need to do their jobs. But, you know, ensuring that that data has integrity and one version of the truth, and then apply the right tool sets to be able to do what's necessary and to interpret and analyze the data. That was kind of the sort of very foundations of it. It's since evolved, and some of you may have heard Mike Goodwin this morning talking about the data strategy from our product perspective. And we're sort of bringing alongside that the enterprise view of data. So all our assets, whether external or internal, how we, you know, drive sort of the value from that. So focus on the outcomes, as everybody's kind of pointed out there, on the business purpose and value, and focus the strategy kind of from that angle. Because the technology is kind of dealt with now, we've done those foundations. Yes, there's an awful lot to do, but it's about, you know, driving the value and also how we organize ourselves around that. And interestingly, we've just engaged, it was about 6 months ago now, a consultancy who's working very closely with us on shaping that strategy set for the whole organization. So that's where we are now, is very much kind of into that strategy.
Makes sense. Graeme, I wonder if you want to come in kind of from a Connect Health perspective. Also, I don't know whether you want to comment almost on like the Sage story from also having been there, but you know, what's your status at Connect Health? How far are you along this journey of really knowing what your data strategy is and where you're going next?
I'll leave the Sage bit to Cate, because it's been a couple of years since I was there, and it was inception when I got there. So from a Connect point of view, I think we're in a decent place in terms of where we are on our journey, but in terms of where we are setting our data strategy, there's still more to do. And I'll give you a very brief sort of overview. What I mean by that is when I arrived about 2.5 years ago, we had already gone through some of the early stuff. We'd kind of started harvesting up, you know, lots of different data sources. We'd kind of created what we call a data warehouse, but it's got a little more to do to evolve that. But it was all very kind of lots of different flavors of the same thing. So every clinical service had its own slice, and that there was no sort of commonality or standardization. But we'd already got that in place, and it was used quite heavily for reporting. It was all very reporting based. It was to report on our clinical outcomes and understand our journey through that. It's to give things back to the commissioners and what have you. So it wasn't a bad place to start, as I've gone quickly from spreadsheets not that long before. But in the last couple of years, we've, you know, similar to Cate and Sage, kind of redone quite a lot of the foundations. We've kind of standardized the data models. We've lifted the tech. I will talk about tech into the cloud. We're moving, you know, everything so that we had a far better place to be able to exploit the data properly. We've got more capacity and flexibility. We've gone quite a long way with people. We've you know, most of the guys are sort of in-house, and training them up and you know, understanding how the data works and how the business works has been really important. But I think we've reached a point now where we've got all of that in place. We've got some great foundational stuff. We've got quite a lot of good foundational tech. But we're at the point now where we know, I use the phrase, there's gold in them thar hills. We sort of, you know, we've always been quite a data-driven business. We've sort of done an awful lot with it to drive how we work, but we don't quite know what else we can do with it. And it's that stage right now. We're trying to really foresee that we've got the gold miner stuff and how we're going to use it to drive true insight and use, you know, some of the really new technology to not just report backwards, but to see what we might do strategically 2 years from now. So that's kind of where we are on that journey. Makes sense.
Cate, I saw you nodding to some
of these. I'm nodding profusely. Did you mean the other Cate?
Yeah, there's lots of nodding, but Cate Martin, I saw you nodding there on some of those points around kind of, you know, been focused on like reporting and almost some of these technology foundations, but now maybe starting to look more towards like what's the real value for the organization. I guess, you know, to that point, what kind of, from your perspective, you know, where are some of those pockets of real value that you're starting to uncover, or, you know, that the wider organization's talking to you about, and how are you starting to get, you know, try and get focused on delivering some of those asks really of what people want from data?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of similarities with what Graeme was talking about. We've got a long history of reporting on that, what has happened in the past. I mean, everyone will, even though there's no one from the NHS, everyone knows about the NHS, so everyone knows the statistics in the press all the time, like what's our A&E performance, how many people are waiting, and that's all historical stuff, and we absolutely can't drop that. However, we've made significant moves in the last couple of years into the what's happening now. So, for example, we're using the data real-time data to support managers at ED departments, so they know where the pressures are. And that's been dependent on getting the systems in, front-end systems, obviously, to capture the data, and some challenges around data standards when you've got sort of not doctors and nurses interacting with systems, so some of the data quality issues there. But as Graeme said, we're absolutely now focused on what can we do, so changing that from what's happening now in the A&E department to what do we think might be happening ahead. So the way it's looking, we might need to think about clearing out some beds at their admission wards. It looks like, based on what's happened in the past, and that preemptive sort of reporting is absolutely what we're aiming for, and can see a real benefit to that. But that's a bit of a different skill set for the staff we've got, and like you said at the start, we've got a really big department and people with lots of NHS data knowledge, but there's a little bit of a step change there. So that's one of our challenges, I think.
It's almost like moving into that what if kind of modelling, predicting, knowing that it's never going to be absolutely right is a different mindset, isn't it? It's kind of very, very accurately reporting on what has happened in absolute terms. And I think, yeah, that is often a bit of a mindset shift if you're just starting to do that. That makes sense. Alex, from a DWP perspective, I guess, there's a large data team that you've got there and lots of kind of places you're trying to use data. What are some of the things you've been working on, and what are the sort of, I guess, coming back to that framework, what is the business value or the organizational value that you're really trying to unlock from data in your role?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the stuff that we've heard already really resonates with me, especially from Cate, coming from another big public sector organization. We've also got a long history of reporting and sort of policy analysis and using data and that sort of long feedback loop way of collecting some data and then creating a bespoke report and giving it to policymakers, and then that sort of dies. We're now trying to sort of focus on our data strategy, treating data as a product and thinking about data in a user-centered way. So identifying who our users are, what sort of decisions they need to make that they need data and insight for, and then how do we best serve those needs using user-centered design, basically. And so we're trying to move it. We're obviously, yes, we still have to do reporting, and we do also have an obligation to produce national statistics on what has happened in the past. We have been doing some forecasting in the department as well, but I think our focus now is on shortening those feedback loops. So as Cate said, yes, looking at more real-time stuff, looking at dashboards, looking at what is happening now, that gives us an ability to be a little bit braver with our experimenting. So if we can really quickly notice things going wrong, then we can fail fast and we can try things that are a little bit more out there. And we're also thinking about things like decision support, so operationalizing data. So bringing the data to the user on the front line, not just the policymakers and the people who make the big decisions that affect people for years to come. It's giving insight to the people who make the small decisions that affect many people in potentially big ways. So thinking about things like embedding analytics in our sort of operational services.
That's really interesting. So yeah, it's kind of, whereas maybe historically data analysis has been almost a little bit ring fence for, like, if you're a policymaker, you can come and ask for some data to kind of inform your decision making. You're actually trying to really bring that data driven behavior into a lot wider audience, really. That's, yeah, really interesting. Katie, I don't know whether, is there parallels there from a Sage perspective? I know there's almost been a kind of push to, within your products for your SME customers, surfacing data to them as a product. Does that fall into your remit, or is that something kind of which sits more in product teams, and how does that work together?
So that's an interesting question. It does sit more with our product teams, but what we're looking at is kind of the use of the product itself by our customers. So we use the data that comes, kind of the telemetry data, if you like, or product usage data that comes from those products to see how customers are behaving. with the potential to identify if there's a problem, if we can see any patterns in, attrition rates, and then feeding that data back into our cycle. And Alex was sort of referring there, into machine learning models, so that we can start to anticipate behaviours in those products, but also in the journey as well. So bringing that data together with how customers behave kind of at the start of their digital journey. And as they move through into becoming one of our customers, we can bring all of that data together and drive out those insights. But moreover, kind of, not just those lagging indicators that we've all described, but starting to do kind of predictive engagements, interventions in the journey, and then that feedback loop, as Alex referred to, making sure that the learnings from that, feed back into the model, and we adjust and we adapt and we continue to improve that experience for the customers, as well as Alex said, again, operationalizing that data so that our service agents and our sales agents have that data in their hands and they can operate differently as a result.
So is it very much a kind of partnership working model where, product teams may come to you if they've got a sort of data related question, and sort of vice versa? Is that how it works? It's almost like your team centre of excellence.
Yeah, interestingly, that is something that we're looking at, and one of the topics that is hot on our agenda at the moment as a result of how we work better together and efficiently together is the data mesh. So we're looking at opportunities and about to sort of do a piece of proof of concept on how do we surface data, the right data products to the right people at the right time, be they in the product teams or the AI or ML teams, or the colleague teams, wherever those people might be, so that they can drive out the insights that they need to do their jobs. But to your point, it's very much a working, we're working and collaborating together on it. And Mike talked earlier about the digital network and bringing data about customers together, in the data that sort of between those different interactions with customers and suppliers and vendors and so on, and how we can create value from that. And part of that as well, we've got the customer data internally, so some of that data is the same. So how do we bring that sort of digital identity together and have one version of that customer throughout across the whole piece? So it's definitely a lot more to learn from that and more to exploit.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've seen the other kind of, I guess, the topic we haven't really touched on deeply yet is around people and org. We're just starting to get into that almost with your comments there, Cate. And it's one of the areas that our audience is saying is one of their biggest challenges. So I wonder whether, I don't know who wants to kind of go first, but I'd be interested to hear kind of what your challenges are from a people perspective, whether it's kind of, skills, almost kind of partnership working. I think maybe Cate, you could kick us off on what you're doing in that sort of strand around people. I think the audience would be really interested to hear that.
Yeah, it's one of our main issues, I would say. Partly it's how do we free up staff to learn new skills when we've got a huge, workload, and how do we build the new stuff and develop new skills when we've got to keep the business as usual going? And what we've started to do is work closely with Newcastle University and get short-term placements in. Sort of we've had one already, another one that's coming in as well, specifically around how we move on our visualization, for example, and that'll be about scoping where we need to be, how we transition to a new way of working, and what the skill set needs to be, and then how we roll out that, how that training. However, one of my main things is to, I'm conscious that the people that are working now, we need to give them more joy than they've currently got. And this is a real opportunity. I've got clever people that come and work for me, and they end up just churning stuff in the old way that we've always done it. Whereas we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We get them doing the exciting stuff. They're doing sort of data and information consultancy rather than just being the gatekeepers, as Alex talked about as well. Where actually they're not sitting there and just handing out bits of data, because it's more automated. We've got some beautiful stuff coming out on the data warehouse and a BI tool, and therefore they can do what we really want them to do, which is the proper analysis, which we call them analysts, but to a large extent what they're doing at the moment isn't. So there's a real carrot for them at the moment, but it's getting headspace, which is why we're engaging with externally with Newcastle University, bringing new sort of data science skills that we haven't got currently. and it may be we need different types of posts in there, but we're still fairly early in that journey, and doing that assessment with Newcastle University is going to be the way that we start to do that.
Yeah, it makes sense. Almost like needing to develop that sort of talent strategy really around data, and what's going to be fit for the future isn't the same necessarily as what's been fit for the past. That makes sense. Graeme, I guess, what are your thoughts on that at Connect Health? How are you thinking about the skills you need in-house, kind of maybe working with third parties for certain aspects of it, and how that's changed really, I suppose, over the last 10-15 years as to who really should be sitting in a data team?
I mean, I think it's similar to Cate's challenges, but I think there's two parts to think about. Is what have you needed in the past that you still need in terms of being able to kind of engineer the warehouse and do that sort of thing, and then there's also, if you're moving into a completely different world of where you're trying to drive true insight from your data source, you are going to need different people. And I think there's an element of we use the people we've got and try and liberate them and leverage their skills as best we can. And we also blend it with new people from the outside when we need them. We haven't stepped over that threshold of engaging data scientists or anything quite like that yet, because we're not at a point we need them. But we start conversations with Nick D about how they might help us in that space and think things through differently. But the guys we've got, when I arrived, we had a sort of team of people who were highly skilled and highly talented, but not from an IT background. They've come from the business, so they know the data inside out. But they're all doing a bit of everything. They're doing reporting, SQL coding, and everything. And we sort of carved it in half and given them a choice. Do you want to move more into technical specialism where you build it? And some of them have moved to like C# developers and all sorts now. They don't just do the warehouse. But the others, do you want to stay in that sort of BI world? And again, by standardizing a lot of the reporting, we don't have to like hand crank 20 flavors of every report. So that's freed them up a little bit. So they've now, some of them are learning Power BI and dashboarding, and it's just that sort of trying to take the people we've got on a journey and give them a choice about where they want to go, and then bring other people in where we need them. But we do use external third parties if we need capacity, but we just haven't got enough people to do it quick enough. We kind of buy the capacity in and get it done. But it always comes back in-house. And then the sort of skill matrix will reassess that as we decide where our 2-year horizon looks like.
Yeah, it makes sense. It definitely resonates with a lot of what I see working with clients in this space. I guess one area I find interesting is around, I always feel like there's a behaviour change needed both within the data team, but maybe more importantly, sometimes it's the sort of the stakeholders and the wider business that also needs to almost change in what they're expecting from the data. It's a sort of two-way conversation that kind of changes that dynamic over time. I wonder, Alex, whether you might want to talk about kind of how you've seen that change over the time you've worked at DWP, that sort of how much you're enabling the business to kind of do things themselves versus, the types of things you're doing within your team. Have you seen that shift, and where do you see that balance between like what's expected from the data team versus what the data team is doing and changing?
I think this has been actually one of our biggest challenges over the last couple of years is changing the mindset of everyone in the business to realize that the data strategy, or rather the strategy for data, is the responsibility of everyone. It's not just the 5 or 6 data scientists that are trying to sort of develop things and do some machine learning. It's everyone, because the data lifecycle start with someone loading some data into a database in a Python notebook and doing machine learning. It starts from collecting the data, or even designing the service that will collect that data and the systems that will collect that data, is designing the infrastructure for it. It's everyone who works in the business has a responsibility for some part of the data lifecycle. And so changing those mindsets among stakeholders, among the business, that has been quite challenging. And I think it's because and like Cate touched on it before previously, we've had analysts who have been doing reporting, and then they've been sort of quite siloed. So they've ended up with the data at the end, produced a report, and probably didn't speak to anyone else in the business. No one else in the business potentially relied on them too much. And especially in my area, we work in health digital, so we're developing digital service. I think bringing data professionals into the setting of digital product development is quite a new thing, and there isn't really a playbook for that. So as much as analysis and data and things like that have been quite established in academia, for example, and in policy analysis and in finance, we haven't had the time to develop a sort of common language together with digital product development. And so learning that common language and learning each other's cultures, that comes really slowly, because it's a change of mindset, it's a change of working practices and cultures. But what we have been trying to do to make that happen is try to work really closely with other teams in digital and with product development teams. So working a lot with engineers to adopt some of their working practices into our working practices. So for example, things like test-driven development or version control. And working with product teams and product professionals to incorporate things like user research and design principles into designing data products. And I think now is the time for us to sort of push some of our data working practices into their worlds to sort of complete the circle, so that we can all really know what we're about and to work better together.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. It's almost trying to become multidisciplinary teams in different spaces where you're really leveraging the kind of skills and mindsets of others to how you're approaching problems. And I completely agree with you, which is and there's been a lot of products and services built over the last 10 years where nobody from a kind of heritage of data has really got involved and said, well, how are we collecting data and why are we collecting it that way? And and actually it's more been like, the data's going to be created as it's created, and then we'll solve the problems that creates sort of downstream, and trying to kind of be more embedded and getting those ways of working more genuinely kind of collaborative is often where a lot of the impact lies. And almost designing for data from the off, I think, is something that you're starting to see a lot more of as people are doing kind of product transformations. Definitely. I guess kind of on that kind of skills perspective around, like almost data professionals being more aware of some of their colleagues' kind of ways of working. So you mentioned things like, engineering principles, user-centered design principles. Is that something that, Cate, for example, at Sage, within the data team, you're actively trying to develop yet? Or is that more something that's sort of on the radar that might come next once you've got some of these foundations you mentioned in place?
Yeah, it's something on the definitely. I think to Alex's point, it's we're thinking about getting as close to the business as we can as possible, understanding what the business is doing on a day-to-day basis, and that's what our focus is currently. And vice versa, bringing in sort of more data skills into those business functions and business areas, so that they, to Graeme's point, are sort of part of the data culture and the drive to become data driven. I'm very interested by some of Alex's ideas, so I'm definitely going to pick those up with you. I like that testing for development idea. I think that's something that we certainly look at adopting potentially.
Well, this brings me on to my sort of final little theme before we wrap up, which is, what are the ideas maybe around what could Dynamo be doing, I guess, to support data professionals within the region going forward? I think these kind of conversations are really valuable, and I'm sure the learnings that many of you have would be kind of translatable. Graeme, I know you've kind of done some stuff in the past with Dynamo, thought about, or at least data cluster or various things, and I think it's a challenge, right? Because it's a sort of vertical versus horizontal thing. There's huge value in a health cluster, and data's part of that, but then it's almost like data's everywhere. So how do you kind of get that matrix right, even within Dynamo almost? But what do you think, Graeme? Is there anything we could or should be doing?
I mean, I think the challenge is exactly what you've said, is that it's embedded in everything. I think what I would encourage and what I would drive through as a Dynamo principle in general is the point of us is to collaborate and share for the greater good. So, and I would say it's really as simple as start with some of these conversations. I'm happy to talk about what we do within company confidentiality as much as anybody would like, and I suspect most of the people involved would be the same. So I think sometimes trying to define what it is and what we do with it is our challenge, and I would just basically encourage us to talk. And if anybody wants to talk some of this stuff through more, the reason all of us is here is so that we are comfortable to share. And I think if we do a little more of that and decide how that might take us forward, use the network, I think, is what I'm saying, as much as anything. It's not one thing you can put in a box easily, which is why we've struggled with it as a sort of concept.
Yeah,
I've got a poll up. I'd be interested if people could go and click on the poll. We can continue talking, but basically it's around, do you see potential value in Dynamo trying to create, whether it is, relatively simple and just like, more sessions like this over time or anything else. I'd just be interested to know from the audience's perspective whether they would see value in that. Katie, go on. What you think?
I was just going to say, I think that, well, certainly when I've had subscriptions with some of these major consulting companies, the best use I've ever had out of them is not the white papers or their analysts, it's from the peers. So absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Well, quite a lot of votes saying yes in the, let us know, vote either way. Yes or not sure. Nobody said no yet. I think that peer learning is really valuable, isn't it? I think particularly where we're kind of, there are also some really great regional assets, I think, like NICD and others, where we don't, I guess, as Dynamo want to be going off in a different direction, but perhaps there's a kind of broader conversation to be had around some of these sort of networking organizations and how could we bring together data professionals in a helpful way. Any thoughts around like networks that exist, that, maybe it's about signposting to those rather than creating new things? Alex?
I think I was just going to say, for me, it's just carry on doing events like this, because this is brilliant for people to just see what other data professionals look like, for representation, for diversity, for inclusivity, for learning, what are similar jobs to mine that I could do. Because I think, the struggle with skills is that a lot of the skills that we need, a lot of the professions that we need at the moment are very new. Like data science as a job title didn't really exist maybe 10 years ago, and it probably won't exist in 5 years. That's my personal opinion. But so there's a lot of people who are working in with slightly different job titles that just need to see what things like data science are, what working in a data focused product team looks like, and get excited about it, and see that they can relate to some of the people working in those teams, and that'll probably, it is really exciting stuff that we do, at least I think so. I have fun at work, so I think if people just see what we do, it's going to be a lot easier for us to attract that talent.
I think that's really true, and I think I also think it's interesting, and this panel demonstrates it, that data careers don't have like one flavor. You may start out as a software developer, you may start out as a data analyst, a statistician, or a customer service person. You don't need to have one particular technical specialization to become a leader with data. It's actually about a mindset and surrounding yourself by the right sets of experts technically, and kind of what you need to get done. So I think, I agree that it's very valuable to be kind of showcasing digital career pathways and data career pathways. Okay, very good. Conscious of time, I guess as a kind of final question, is there any one thing you'd like to know from each other? Give you a chance to ask the group as a final question. Katie, have you got any questions for them?
Wow. Not off the top of my head. I certainly want to pick up with Alex after the call on some of the ideas that she's brought up in just talking around approach to development. So I'll definitely be doing that with you, Alex.
Yeah, no problem.
Kate, anything, your burning question you've got for the rest of the group?
Yeah, I don't want to pick on Alex as well, but one of the things we are grappling with is the roles of data scientists within the organisation. I know there'll be senior managers we're struggling to make headway as saying, well, we just need some data scientists. But actually, what do you need a data scientist for? And it will be really useful to understand how they're embedded and how they're used within DWP, I would say.
Yeah, I think we're obviously still trying to figure things like that out. Like our organization is changing massively, especially under digital transformation. So we're still trying to figure out what the shape of the team is and what the requirements are. And do we actually need data scientists, or do we need digital performance analysts or data analysts, or what's the difference between these roles? Like, how do we recruit differently for them? So it's definitely still stuff that we're working out and we're trying to figure out. But what I would say is that My team specifically is a multidisciplinary team. So even though we're the data team, we have an interaction designer in the team, a user researcher, a data engineer, a platform engineer, a data architect. So we've got all the different roles under the sun that allow us to sort of look at that data journey from end to end. So from sort of designing the services to designing the systems, to building the systems, to working with the data, to delivering the data and designing the insights and delivering that to the users. So I would say, yeah, think about whether you actually need data scientists, or do you also need other professionals that will sort of work with data scientists to help you sort of cover the entire end-to-end process.
Yeah, we've had similar, Kate, you know, making the distinction between the engineer and the scientist. And actually what we want is the scientists and the analysts to live in the business, not in the technology function or necessarily in the data team. We want it to be a community, but certainly there are technical skills needed sort of to get the data to where it needs to be, which is kind of in the engineer space. So we've made that distinction.
That's my main takeaway from this conversation, I think, is maybe the next session we should have is almost like some sharing on almost like org structures, ways of working, and just show and tell almost as people feel comfortable to do that. I think that feels like a theme that would be really valuable. Okay, very good. Conscious of time, keen to wrap up. Thank you all very much. I think I certainly learned a lot from the session about kind of what's going on within your organizations, and some thoughts around kind of, yeah, how to tackle different parts of data strategy. So thank you all, and thanks to those who listened. We'll see you on another session hopefully later.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.